No new coronavirus restrictions will be introduced in England before the new year, despite a record number of cases on Christmas Day. The Health Secretary says people should remain cautious and urged people to celebrate New Year's Eve outside if possible.
We'll watch the situation very carefully, and should in the future we need to act, of course we won't hesitate to do so.
A sharp rise in the number of coronavirus cases in Scotland, the highest yet, as new restrictions in bars and restaurants come into force. Emergency talks between the government and the UK's energy industry amid warnings that bills could go up by 50% next year unless the government intervenes. In South Africa, a week of events begins to commemorate the anti-apartheid campaigner Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And England's hopes of an Ashes comeback are fading rapidly in a dramatic second day of the third test in Melbourne. Good evening. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has ruled out any new coronavirus restrictions in England before the new year. It comes after the Prime Minister met his scientific advisers today to discuss the latest COVID data and the impact that the Omicron variant is having. The Health Secretary said 90% of COVID cases in England are now thought to be the Omicron variant, and he urged people to be cautious with their New Year's Eve celebrations, saying the government won't hesitate to act in the future if necessary. Tighter restrictions have come into effect today in Northern Ireland and Scotland, which yesterday recorded more than 11,000 COVID cases in one day, a new record. Here's our correspondent, Simon Jones.
After the Christmas festivities, tough decisions. The government has been poring over the latest COVID data to see if it thinks new measures are needed in England. But this afternoon, this decision.
There will be no further measures before the new year. We won't be taking any further measures. Of course, people should remain cautious as we approach New Year celebrations, and take a lateral flow test if that makes sense. Celebrate outside if you can. Have some ventilation indoors if you can. Please remain cautious.
At this bar in Bristol, they say many customers have decided of their own accord to stay away.
We've already lost a very, very big trading period, already a really key trading period. Next month it'll have little impact because it's a quiet time of year anyway.
The government will continue to look at hospital admissions, although early findings last week suggested people with Omicron were less likely to be admitted, along with staff absences and whether the NHS faces being overwhelmed.
COVID is having a significant impact on staffing in our emergency departments. The most common figure coming back at us is that departments are reporting 20–25% of their staff off because of COVID-related reasons at the moment. And that's a really, really big deal for emergency departments.
Yesterday in Wales, social distancing measures were reintroduced. From today in Northern Ireland, there are new restrictions for pubs and restaurants. It'll be table service only, and a maximum of 6 people will be allowed to sit together.
We try to be sensible and both protect ourselves and each other.
I am slightly bewildered. I don't understand them. I've come over from Scotland, so everything's different.
Table service too has come in Scotland, where alcohol is served. Nightclubs will have to close for a period of at least 3 weeks. The Scottish Health Secretary this morning visited a vaccination centre in Perth. Over Christmas, Scotland recorded the highest number of daily COVID cases since the start of the pandemic.
This is still going to be very difficult for businesses. But of course, if we let this virus run out of control or get ahead of us, that would be even worse for the economy.
Downing Street says it won't hesitate to act if more restrictions in England are needed in the future. Today's briefing by scientists is one of a series of regular updates given to the Prime Minister. For now, it's a call for caution, but New Year celebrations are set to look very different in different parts of the UK. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Our political correspondent Ian Watson is with me now. So a record number of new cases on Christmas Day in England, but England still on a very different path to the rest of the UK.
That's right, Sophie. A very divergent path from the other nations in the UK, in the sense that not only are there no new restrictions being imposed today, but no new restrictions between now and the new year. Now, the Prime Minister was briefed by his scientific and medical advisors today, and Downing Street sources say they didn't see anything in the data that made him push the red button to accelerate restrictions in England. By ruling out those restrictions, he's also ruling out the recall of Parliament. He promised to do that if there was going to be new restrictions. And speaking to one of the 100 MPs that rebelled against his COVID pass measures earlier this month, they were saying he would have faced an even bigger rebellion had he recalled Parliament, and if he could not produce hard and fast data that the NHS in England was ready to be overwhelmed. So certainly I think his political opponents will suggest that that perhaps was weighing in his mind and why he was taking that divergent path. But it is a big gamble now for Boris Johnson, isn't it? Because if he manages to keep the economy open and if the NHS isn't overwhelmed, then the plaudits he'll get will go far beyond his own party. If, however, hospitalisations increase sharply in the new year, then his opponents will say he's putting politics ahead of public health.
Ian Watson, thank you. Well, let's look now at the latest government data. There are a lot of figures that still aren't available because of the holiday period. But what we do know today is that there were 98,515 new infections recorded in England alone in the latest 24-hour period. That's after a record number, almost 114,000 were recorded in England on Christmas Day and more than 100,000 on Boxing Day. 143 deaths were recorded in England. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test. In total, nearly 32.5 million people have had a booster. That's 56.5% of the UK population aged over 12. So very little new data from Wales or Northern Ireland over Christmas, but Scotland has today published its figures for the last 3 days, which haven't yet been included in the UK totals. But what they do show is a record rise in new cases in Scotland over the Christmas break. In a moment, we'll get the latest on the situation in Northern Ireland with Louise Cullen. But first, let's talk to Katrina Renton in Glasgow and a big leap in cases.
Well, that's right. And as you've been hearing, new restrictions were introduced here in Scotland today on hospitality and indoor public venues, just as those new figures were released for the last 3 days. Now, the provisional figures peaked at 11,030 cases reported yesterday on Boxing Day. Now, that compares, for your information, with just over 7,000 on Christmas Eve. And the figures reported for Christmas Day and today were also higher than at any other time in the pandemic too. Now, the First Minister is warning that that figure is likely to be higher still due to the lag in reporting time. And Nicola Sturgeon said that the expected wave of cases fuelled by the Omicron variant was materialising. Now, the new restrictions introduced today include distancing of a metre in pubs, table service in pubs and distancing of a metre in other inside public venues. Yesterday, limits on crowds were introduced, so the large-scale public Hogmanay events will be cancelled as a result of that. Now, the restrictions are due to be reviewed on the 11th of January, but looking at those big rises in case numbers, the question will be what happens to hospital admissions, and that, no doubt, will inform what happens next here.
Katrina, thank you. Let's get the latest from Louise Cullen, who is in Northern Ireland, and new restrictions have come into force there as well.
Yes, from today it's strongly recommended that people limit their mixing in private homes and that they continue to work from home. There are changes too to the laws around face coverings, with some exemptions no longer accepted and people having to prove if they have a medical exemption. But the main focus is on hospitality. It's a return to table service in pubs, cafes and restaurants, and also a return to the rule of 6 people or households at a table. Now, to support the hospitality industry, there's been a £40 million package announced, but that's only for these measures. The Finance Minister has said that there is additional money available should additional restrictions be required. The power sharing executive here will meet on Thursday to review what's already in place and see if anything else is needed. There were warnings that significant interventions would be required after Christmas, according to health professionals. But they'll be making those decisions based on figures that haven't yet been published. We'll find out here in Northern Ireland on Wednesday just exactly what effect Omicron has had on our figures over the Christmas period.
Louise with the latest there, thank you. There have been emergency talks between the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the UK's energy industry to try to resolve the ongoing crisis caused by rising wholesale gas prices. Energy companies have warned that bills could go up by 50% next year without government action. One energy company boss predicted the impact on consumers would be an enormous crisis. Theo Leggett reports.
A midwinter meeting at a time when the energy industry is facing an unprecedented crisis. The cost of gas on European wholesale markets has been hitting record levels, and suppliers say consumers here will end up paying a heavy price. Energy companies themselves have already been badly hit. More than 24 have gone out of business since the summer, and more casualties are expected. That's because so far they've had to absorb most of the extra costs themselves. It's a situation that won't last.
If we don't find a solution in the coming weeks, we're certainly going to be locking UK consumers into more and more expensive energy for years to come.
People within the industry say ministers could consider cutting the environmental and social levies that energy consumers have to pay.
A real rethink, listening to the industry leaders to see what they recommend, would be an important thing to do before February. And February is when Ofgem meets to decide what its price is going to be for the domestic consumer on the 1st of April.
Labour wants VAT on bills to be removed. Today's meeting is unlikely to be the last. The government says talks will continue over the coming days and weeks to ensure UK consumers are protected. Theo Leggett, BBC News.
West Mercia Police have sent a written apology to the relatives of the former Premier League footballer Dalian Atkinson 6 months after an officer who tasered him and kicked him in the head was jailed for manslaughter. West Mercia's Chief Constable, Pippa Mills, said she was deeply sorry, adding that a police uniform did not grant officers immunity to behave unlawfully. South Africa has begun a week of events to commemorate the anti-apartheid leader Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who died yesterday, aged 90. Our correspondent, Nomsa Maseko, is outside St George's Anglican Cathedral in Cape Town. Nomsa.
Well, we are here outside the St George's Cathedral here in Cape Town, and this marks where the majority of events are going to be taking place in honor of Desmond Tutu. He was a man of a small stature, but indeed with a very big heart, and that is what South Africans are going to remember about him. After all, he was the man chosen by Nelson Mandela to head the South African reconciliation process. It was not an easy process, but he did continue with that. There are also going to be a number of memorial services that are going to take place, not just here in Cape Town, but of course in many other parts of this country. There's going to be an intimate service as well that will be held amongst his closest friends on Thursday. The Archbishop's body is expected to lie in state here at this cathedral on Friday night for one night, and then on Saturday morning his funeral service will be held here, and this is where his ashes are also going to be interred.
Nomsa Maseko, thank you. Weather and climate has taken its toll on the UK's trees and animals in the last year. A report from the National Trust says weather events like Storm Arwen are proving a challenge to many of Britain's species, which are already in decline. England's cricketers are sliding towards a series defeat in the Ashes. Australia are already 2-0 up in the 5-match series and could retain the Ashes tomorrow, as our sports correspondent Joe Wilson reports.
England's players were unsure for a while if they'd even be allowed in the ground. 4 COVID cases amongst the support staff and their family. But after the test, it continued. And yes, England prospered. Marnus Labuschagne batting, ranked world #1, out for 1. Success for Mark Wood. And what about Steve Smith? Well, here comes James Anderson.
Oh, he's got him, bowled him. And it's...
England quickly dismissed Australia's most esteemed batters. Hey, We're in this. Maybe. Marcus Harris persevered for Australia, not always pretty, but past 50, and that feeling of optimism, it was sneaking away from England. As so often, they needed Anderson. Captain's grateful hands and Harris was gone. But a late flourish helped Australia build their lead. When their innings finally ended, they were 82 runs ahead. And in the last hour, the true context of the day's play. England batting again, Zach Crawley out for 5. The very next ball, David Malan, LBW. Hasib Hamid couldn't last, faint edge, he was gone. So Jack Leach was sent in to defend and defy. 31 for 4, and Australia will be back for more. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
And that's it from us. We'll be back with the late news at 10. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Goodbye.